Hello everybody and welcome back to Unusual Art. I am your host Marios and today is part 2 of the first episode of Unusual Art Parallels. In the first episode we went back in time and told the story of Daedalus and Icarus, and this time we will tell the story of the Group B era of rallying, an era iconic and familiar at least by name to every single motorsport enthusiast. Then we will take a step back and compare the two stories and make conclusions as to their parallels and their overall meaning. As ever, if you enjoy this podcast, push the like button and subscribe to the channel in order to never miss any new content, and please press the bell button. Finally, let your friends know about our existence by sharing this podcast on social media platforms. But for now, let's travel back to the glorious 1980s. What a nice sound. Anyway, before we start our trip, we must remind ourselves and those who might be unfamiliar with rallying, its humble beginnings. So, rallying, along with other forms of motor racing, finds its origins in the early 20th century. It originally was amateur in nature, and it was just a hobby for motor enthusiasts who were just using their normal road car. It was a way for the adventurers and the brave to test their skills and their cars in various circumstances and conditions. But gradually throughout the years it started to become more and more professional, and by the early 1980s the World Rally Championship, or WRC for short, consisted of events in 12 different countries across the world and in various roads, from snowy Sweden to the rough Greek terrain and Africa's tough safari rally. Manufacturers including Fiat, Ford, Lancia and Peugeot were trying their best to show off their engineering prowess in order to boost their international profile and their road car sales. But the origins of what became Group B were a few years before that. It was the end of the 1970s, and FISA, the governing body of all things motorsport back then, invited the BPICA, an organization which represented the interests of car manufacturers in motorsport, to help negotiate for the new rules in the World Rally Championship. The main idea was for there to be less regulations and more freedom, and to accomplish this, an overhaul of the current rulebook was necessary. The outcome was that all of the road car-based racing categories would be regrouped into a total of 3 new groups: Group A, Group B and Group C. The FISA added a 4th category, Group N, at the last moment, but the manufacturers had near zero interest in it at the time. These new regulations were set to go into effect on January 1st, 1982. The main idea of Group B was to help lure more car manufacturers into motorsport by bringing down the costs and promising quicker car development. To enter, a manufacturer only had to build 200 homologation cars in the span of 12 months, instead of the 400 required by the preceding Group 4. This greatly reduced the cost for car manufacturers but promised greater performance. Basically, the car makers could build whatever car their designers imagined, and their budgets could afford. As for these new regulations, there were not many of them for the cars to follow. Apart from the basic safety requirements, the cars only had to have the following. The car could not have an open roof. The car had to have 2 front seats side by side. A minimum race weight calculated by engine displacement and forced induction factor. A maximum tire width calculated by engine displacement and forced induction factor. This is just a basic overview for the purpose of understanding the level of freedom the manufacturers were given. For a car to be accepted into the B category, the manufacturers had to build at least 200 road-going versions of the car in a 12-month period as mentioned before, and then these cars would be counted by a FISA official. It is thought that some manufacturers tricked the officials into counting a single car twice. These new cars were made with even more exotic and expensive materials. They had clever aerodynamic components and most importantly power. Lots and lots of power. cars became more challenging, and initially drivers loved it. Despite the excitement though from all sides, the omens were not good from the start, as rallying had a history of fatal accidents up to that point, and in slower cars than those which were being created. The safety standards were often inadequate, both in car and spectator safety. Nonetheless, during this brief period, legendary cars made their appearance, such as the Audi Quattro, the Peugeot 205 and the Lancia Delta S4, and with the ever-rising popularity of Group B throughout those early years, rallying drivers like Stig Blomqvist, Ari Vatanen, Walter Röhrl and Michel Mouton became ever so popular across the world, and their names echo even to this day. Crowds were constantly and increasingly gathering in order to see Audi compete against Lancia and the other car manufacturers. The popularity of rallying during this brief period surpassed even Formula 1, but this presented a problem which was not thought of particularly well. As briefly mentioned before, there were not strict orders on how to control the thousands and in some cases millions of spectators during the rallies. This resulted in the spectators mostly standing directly next to the road from which the rally cars passed. Especially in Portugal, there was such a rally frenzy that jumping out of the car's way became sort of a national pastime, which further evolved into touching the cars as they were driving by. One who could achieve this feat would be considered a hero among their peers, but this ultimately led to the Peugeot and Lancia crews finding blood, hair and even severed fingers stuck in the wings and ducts of their cars. Any collision injury was a badge of honor. Drivers also reported many other problems caused by spectators, which included having things thrown at their cars and placing obstacles on the road, but organizers kept insisting that they could not control the entire length of the stage. As we reached 1985, 3 years into the new rules, things were as fast and as dangerous as ever. In the first rally of the season in Monte Carlo, Ari Vatanen ran over some spectators on his way to victory, thankfully with no deaths involved. But this was an indication of the things to come. Things were not going to go better. On May 2nd, 1985, during the Tour de Corse, a Lancia 037 driven by Attilio Bettega and his co-driver Maurizio Perissigno slid off the road into a ditch and hit a tree. The Lancia was torn apart by the impact. As the co-driver did not sustain any injuries, he went to flag down cars coming after them. It took about 20 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, but the doctors said that it would not have mattered if it arrived any earlier, as Attilio Bettega had died instantly from the impact of the crash. This crash made FISA review the safety of the cars of Group B, and it was deemed that even though the cars were made to be very lightweight, there was still sufficient protection from the roll cage. It was also concluded that no other racing series car would have saved the driver's life either. By this time, drivers had already said that the cars were extremely hard to handle with such performance levels, and co-drivers had a very hard time keeping up with the pace notes as everything happened so quickly. Walter Röhrl, one of the greatest Group B racers, said that finding the balance between outright speed and pace was a challenge in itself. Group B, though, had claimed its first victim. Lancia withdrew from the rally immediately, though the rest continued as normal. Later in the same rally, Ari Vatanen suffered a huge accident, as he was also trying to close the gap to the leader. But he and his co-driver miraculously escaped any major injuries, though later in the season, in the Argentine rally in August, his luck ran out when he crashed his car again and then his seat snapped, and he suffered life-threatening injuries. Crushed knees, 8 broken ribs, a broken leg, a broken back and a punctured lung. He spent 18 months recovering, first from his injuries and then from severe depression. He never raced a Group B car again. As 1986 fastly approached, even more manufacturers tried their hand at winning, trying to capitalize from FISA's relaxed rules. But it was the iconic Lancia Delta that turned out to be the fastest. Lancia had put the latest technology in their creation and immense power, and their young and supremely talented driver Henri Toivonen made them favorites from the start of the season for the title. Toivonen's win at the first rally of the season in Monte Carlo seemed to confirm this status. But all these cars and drivers and their speed was not without consequences. Drivers had by then begun to look even more exhausted both physically and mentally after each rally, and this was compounded by the fact that rallies and stages were longer in duration back then. After the finish of the Monte Carlo rally, news came out that another spectator had been hit by a car and had been hospitalized with a smashed leg. This made everyone question about safety, as the cars had more than doubled in power in the 4 years since the new rules were introduced, but safety standards remained substandard, especially in crowd control. As everyone converged on Portugal for the third rally of the season, nobody knew that things were about to get a lot worse. Joaquim Santos, the Portuguese national champion, was driving the latest Ford RS200, but suddenly he lost control of his car at 135 km per hour. He plowed into the spectators that had gathered to watch their local hero try to mix it with the big names. A mother and her child were instantly killed. 32 others were injured, and one spectator later died of his wounds in the hospital. Some still claim that the spectator made a step towards the road and that Santos simply tried to avoid hitting him, causing him to lose control of the car. The day's running was cancelled and the top drivers decided to strike. But the FISA president did not consider taking any action against the organizers or taking any further measures for safety, instead criticizing the big teams and the big drivers. Audi pulled out of rallying immediately, but the rest soldiered on. In the next rally in Kenya, Marco Allen accidentally ran over a child, thankfully not fatally this time, but the writing was already on the wall for Group B. Safety concerns had already arisen and pressure was mounting for something to be done. In the next event though, in Corsica, where 1 year earlier Bettega had died, things were about to get a lot more serious. Henri Toivonen was pressing his Lancia Delta so hard that by the fifth stage on the second day of the rally, he was more than 1 minute quicker than his closest competitor. But there was a slight problem. Toivonen had been complaining of flu-like symptoms. He was not well, but his performance did not show that, so there was not much concern taken. He was flying, but then he lost control of his car and plunged down a ravine and landed on its car's roof. The aluminium fuel tank was directly underneath the driver's seat and was ruptured by the trees and exploded. Toivonen and his co-driver Sergio Cresto had no time at all to get out, and both men burned to death in their seats. Toivonen was still only 29 years old and heralded to be the next great rally driver. After that accident that had shocked the world, FISA President Balestri announced a freeze in the car's development and their ban from 1987 onwards. The die had been cast for Group B. Though these monstrous cars would continue to race in other forms of competitions, the regulations for the World Rally Championship were significantly restricted from then onwards, as well as safety standards were significantly increased. The legacy this era left behind is felt even today, nearly 40 years removed from Toivonen's untimely demise. That was it for Group B, though if you want to learn even more details and events that I overlooked, as this is just the basic story, I highly recommend 2 amazing documentaries that were used as research in this podcast. The first is called Too Fast to Race, and the second is called Rallying the Killer Gears. I recommend both of them highly. So, now that we have told both of these amazing stories, it is time to analyze both of them side by side and see the parallels which appear in both stories, to try and find what the meaning behind all of this is. Daedalus became greedy when he tried to kill Talos, as he wanted all the glory for himself. King Minos became greedy as he did not honor his side of the deal with Poseidon and tried to keep the beautiful bull for himself. Icarus became greedy when he disregarded his father's advice and tried to reach the sun. The car manufacturers became greedy because they wanted more freedom for exposure and money, neglecting potential safety features. The same reasons apply to FISA too. They also wanted increased revenue, profits, and higher viewership figures, higher attendance figures, but with also blatant disregard for potential safety dangers for the drivers or the spectators. The drivers, though not in specific fault, still raced in cars which evidently ended up impacting their health, both mentally and physically. As we know, being too greedy ends up destroying you, and this is the case for both of our stories. A second life lesson that these stories teach us is to be within reason and always within your capabilities. Daedalus mastered flying through being reasonable and sticking to a safe zone. Rallying in the years after Group B and through to the present day has been incredibly successful and has produced many spectacular cars and drivers, but with ever so high safety standards, as the main priority became enjoying rallying while being safe, both as a driver and as a spectator. Except from these life lessons though, these stories also teach us to appreciate creators and their art. Daedalus's legendary artistic capabilities and his story have survived for 2000 years, while the cars that this brief Group B era produced have achieved legendary status among car enthusiasts, and their legend only increases year by year with car demonstrations showing to the crowds the magic of an era long gone. And finally, always, as always, the what ifs. What if Talos had not been thrown off the Acropolis by Daedalus? What if Icarus had survived? What if Toivonen had not died? And with that, unusual art parallels comes to an end, at least for now. If you enjoyed this ride, like and subscribe to the channel, and share this with your friends. I was your host Marius, and please, have a nice day.